The men at the saloon window were already laying down coin before the stage had stopped rolling. Augusta Whitmore heard the laughter before she saw the faces, that particular pitchmen used when they thought a woman could not hear, or did not count enough to be spared. She set her gloved hand on the doorframe of the coach, stepped down onto the warped planks of the Bitter Creek depot, and the planks complained under her, and a boy on the boardwalk shouted something about a barn door and a hinge, and another voice from the saloon hollered back the over-under on Sunday. She did not look up. She did not flinch. She did not pull her shawl tighter or her chin lower. She counted the 4 extra coins the stage driver demanded for weight out of her purse one at a time into his palm, and she made him say thank you. He did not. She said it for him, quietly. "You're welcome," and turned to look down the dust street of the only town she had ever heard of called Bitter Creek. And a tall, gaunt, bearded man with a hat held in both hands was standing beside a wagon at the hitching post, looking past her shoulder as though there were a second woman somewhere behind her he had been expecting instead, and something inside her cracked open. If this story already has your chest tight, do me one favor before we go any further. Hit that subscribe button and follow Augusta's story all the way to the end, because what Bitter Creek is about to learn about this woman is not something you'll want to walk in on halfway. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Augusta's story travels. It was the 3rd week of August in the year 1885, and the high plains were the color of an old saddle, and the wind that came down off the broken hills behind the town carried with it the smell of dry sage and cattle, and the iron mineral edge of the only creek that ran year-round inside a 20-mile circle. Augusta knew that last fact because she had read it on the back of the letter she carried, folded twice inside her glove. The letter had been written in a stiff, careful hand by a man named Calvin Burnside, foreman, and it had described a 4,000-acre cattle operation on creek-fed bottomland, a quiet widower of good character, a clean spare room, and the offer of a marriage of partnership rather than of romance. She had read the letter 4 times on the train. She had answered it, once, in pencil, on the back of a torn page from her father's account book. The last book of his she had kept after the bank in St. San. Louis had sold the rest, and she had said yes plainly, and named her terms plainly, and bought her ticket with the last of what was hers. The gaunt man with the hat in his hands waited until the stage driver had thrown her trunk down into the dust. Then he walked over and lifted the trunk by both handles, as though it weighed nothing, though it weighed a great deal, and he carried it to the back of the wagon and set it down inside, without looking at her once. "Mr. Calder," she said. "Ma'am." He still did not look at her. He looked at the trunk, and at the dust on the boards of the wagon bed, and at the off-mule's twitching ear. His voice was low and dry, the voice of a man who had not had to use it often in 3 years. "Cal sent the letter." "I know. I want you to know I didn't write it. I know that too. He signed it on your behalf, and printed his own name underneath. I read it." That made him look at her. Finally, a quick, surprised cut of the eye, gray and tired, set deep in a face that the sun had used hard. He looked at her the way a man looks at a horse he has been told is gentle, but expects to bite. He did not flinch. That was the thing she noticed first, before anything else. And she filed it away in a quiet room inside herself and closed the door on it for later. He did not flinch. "There's a spare room," he said. "It's clean. The kitchen, you can use it. The eastbound goes through Thursday next. If you want to ride it back, the fare's mine. No quarrel. I'll stay the week," she said, "and see." He nodded once. He helped her up onto the wagon seat with a hand at her elbow, that he removed the instant her weight was settled, the way a man removes a hand from a hot stove. She arranged her skirt over her knees. She put her gloved hands in her lap. She did not look back at the saloon window, though she could feel the eyes on the back of her neck like a row of pinpricks, and she could hear faintly a man at the window calling out 3 days, 2 bits, on 3 days, and someone else laughing and saying, "Make it Sunday, Sunday, for $1, and the dollar was slapped down on wood, loud enough to carry. Holt Calder did not seem to hear them. Or if he heard them, he did not let her know he had. He clucked once at the mules, and the wagon rocked forward, and the dust of Bitter Creek began to fall behind them. They rode for a long time without speaking. The road ran north out of the town along a low fence line of cottonwood posts and rusted wire, and then it bent west and climbed a long slow rise, and from the top of the rise she could see the country open out in front of her, a great brown bowl scooped between low hills, with a thread of darker green winding through the middle of it, and that, she understood without being told, was the creek. The creek was the whole thing. The letter had said as much. The whole 4,000 acres lived or died by that ribbon of green. "Mr. Calder, ma'am, how long has it been since the note was current?" He took a breath that he did not let out for some time. He looked at the off-mule's ear again. "Don't rightly know," he said at last. "I pay when Marsh tells me to pay. He tells me the figure. I bring it in, he marks it down. You don't keep your own book." "I kept one." "Mary kept one? She handled the figures." He paused. "I haven't kept one since." "How long?" "3 winters, I see." "I know how it sounds." "It doesn't sound like anything yet," she said. "It's only a fact. Facts don't sound. People sound." He glanced at her again, sidelong, and she thought she saw something move at the corner of his mouth that on another face might have been the beginning of a smile, and on his was only a very small loosening of the jaw. He clucked at the mules again, and the wagon went on. The house came up out of a fold in the land, the way ranch houses do, hidden until you were nearly on top of it. It was a low, long, plank and stone affair, with a porch running the front, and a stovepipe leaning slightly off true, and a kitchen wing built on at one end, with its own door, painted once green and now the color of weathered moss. Behind it stood a barn larger than the house, and beyond the barn a set of corrals, and beyond those the creek itself, lined with cottonwoods that hissed in the wind. A black and white dog rose up off the porch and came down the steps, stiff-legged, and barked once and stopped barking. When Holt said his name Tully, Holt said, "He won't bite. I don't expect him to." He set the brake. He carried her trunk inside through the front door and not the kitchen door, and she noted the choice without remarking on it. She followed him in. The front room was clean enough, in the way a man living alone keeps a room clean, meaning the floor was swept and the dust on the mantel was only 1 week's worth. And the spare room, he showed her, was small and square, and had a narrow iron bedstead and a chest and a window that looked out at the creek. He set the trunk at the foot of the bed. "Supper's at 6, he said. "I usually take it cold. There's bread, there's a ham, I'll cook." He stopped in the doorway. He did not turn around. He stood there a moment with his hand on the jamb. "There's a kitchen," he said in a voice gone careful. "It's through that door off the front room. Mary's kitchen. I don't go in there much. You're welcome to it. The cook stove on the back porch works. There's a smaller stove out there. Why not the kitchen?" He did not answer for a long moment. Then he said, "I haven't opened that door in 3 years." And he walked away down the hall, and she heard the front screen slap shut behind him. She stood in the spare room for a moment, with her hands at her sides. She listened to the wind in the cottonwoods. She thought about the kitchen door she had not yet seen, and about the man who had not flinched, and about the men at the saloon window, placing coins on a wooden bar. She thought, not for the first time in her life, and not for the last, about how many doors a person could close in a single life and still keep walking. She unpinned her hat. She set it on the chest. She took her gloves off finger by finger and laid them inside the crown of the hat. She rolled her sleeves to the elbow. Then she walked through the front room and through a low door at the back of it, and stopped. But there was a long pine table in the center of the room, scrubbed once and not since, and on the table was the mail. It was stacked in 3 uneven towers, leaning against each other, the topmost letters bleached almost white by sun coming through the kitchen window, the bottom letters yellowed at the edges. There was an oilcloth half pulled across them, as though someone, sometime, had meant to hide them and then given up. There was a tin candlestick at one end of the table, with the candle burnt down to a stump. There was a copper kettle on the stove with a film of dust on its lid. There was a cast-iron skillet hanging on a nail with a thin gray bloom of cold grease across its surface. There was a string of red peppers above the window, faded almost to brown. There was an apron on a peg by the door, gray cotton with small blue flowers, and the apron had not been moved in 3 years. The dust on the shoulders of it had settled into the weave. Augusta stood in the middle of the room with her arms at her sides. She did not touch the apron. She did not touch the mail. She did not yet touch anything. She closed her eyes for one breath, and then she opened them. "All right," she said quietly. To no one. "All right then." She lit the candle from a kitchen match in the tin on the window sill. She found a lamp and trimmed the wick and lit that too, though the sun had not yet gone. She went to the back porch and looked at the small stove and found it cleaner than the kitchen one, and decided she would use the kitchen stove anyway, because the kitchen was the room you cooked in, and a room that was not used became a room that could not be used, and that was the beginning of every house's end. She built a small fire. She put a kettle of water on. She came back to the table, and she sat down at it with the mail on her left and a pencil from her pocket on her right, and a sheaf of folded brown butcher paper she had taken from beside the stove, because she did not yet know where Mary Calder had kept her writing paper. She read every letter in the stack. It took her until past dark. Holt came in at 6, found the bread cut and the ham warmed, and a pot of beans she had thrown together out of a sack in the pantry, and seasoned with the last of a salt pork bone she had found wrapped in newspaper at the back of the cellar shelf. And he sat down at the long pine table, at the place where she had cleared a square of mail away to make room for him. And he ate without looking at the towers of paper on the other end of the table. He ate slowly and carefully, and with a hunger he was clearly trying not to show. He took 2 helpings of beans. He took 3 slices of bread. He said, "This is good," once, to his plate, not to her. He washed his own plate in the basin, afterward, and went out to the barn. She kept reading. By 8 o'clock she had separated the mail into 4 piles. The first pile was letters from the Bitter Creek Bank and Trust, signed by Aldous Marsh, President, in a sloping hand with a long flourish on the M. There were 31 of them, going back 4 years. The second pile was statements from the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, every one of them, with a typed letterhead and a printed signature, listing weights sold and prices paid, and the deduction taken at the gate. The third pile was bills and dunning notes from feed suppliers, and a saddlery in Cheyenne, and a freight company out of Laramie. The fourth pile, the smallest, was a single letter from a Mrs. Thader, Eleanor Hollis, on cream paper, dated 19 months back, asking after Holt's health and saying she would bring honey when next she rode this way. Augusta started with the bank letters. She lined them up by date. She took the original note. She found it folded into thirds and creased white along the folds at the bottom of the first stack, dated August of 1881. And she smoothed it flat on the table, under the lamp, and she read it 3 times. It was a promissory note for $4,500 at what the document called a service rate of 9% per annum, with an additional administrative charge of 0.75% per quarter, payable in semi-annual installments, with various clauses regarding default and acceleration that ran small and tight along the bottom of the second page. She took her pencil. She did the figures. 9% per annum, plus 0.75% per quarter, compounded. That came to a real rate of. She worked it twice, and then a third time on a fresh sheet of butcher paper that came to a real rate of just over 12%. Already, even on the face of it, above the territorial statute that she happened to know, capped honest interest at 10. She had known that statute because her father, before the San Insure Louis Bank had taken his books, had had Wyoming clients, and her father had taught her to read every state and territory's usury law the way a girl in another house might learn to read music. But it did not stop there. She took the statements from Marsh's bank and matched them one at a time against what Holt had actually paid, and she found that on every payment Marsh had added what he called a collection fee, ranging from $12 to $40 depending on the season, and what he called a stock assessment, and what he called a clearance charge. None of those were named in the note. None of them. She added them up. She divided them out across the life of the note. Tsack. By the time she had 4 pages of figures spread across the table in front of her, the lamp guttering low and the candle long since dead, she had what she needed. The real rate, all in, calculated honestly against the principal, came to a hair over 18%. She put the pencil down. She sat back in the chair. She looked at the apron with the small blue flowers hanging on its peg by the door, and she thought quietly. Mary Calder, you knew, didn't you? You knew something was wrong. She did not cry, she did not even sigh. She stacked her 4 pages of figures together. She folded them in half. She put them inside the original note for safekeeping and slid the whole thing into the pocket of her skirt. And she got up and damped the lamp and went to bed. And she lay there for a long time with her eyes open in the dark, listening to the cottonwoods, and listening to the slow, heavy step of a man pacing the floor of the room at the other end of the house, back and forth, the way a man paces when he is trying to walk a grief down. In the morning, she made coffee and biscuits and gravy and set them on the table at 5:30, and when Holt came in from the barn, she set down a cup of coffee in front of him and waited until he had taken the first long swallow of it before she asked him, "Mr. Calder, what rate do you believe you are paying Mr. Marsh on the note?" He looked up at her over the rim of the cup. He looked at her for a long moment, the way a man might look at a stranger who had asked his middle name. 9, he said. 9%. That's what Mary said when we took it out. 9 even. 9 even. Plus what he calls his service. Couple of dollars. He told me the service is what keeps the bank running. That there's no proper bank closer than Cheyenne. He said it was a kindness. How much have you paid him all in? Since 1881. Holt set the cup down. I don't know. Would you mind if I worked it out? He looked at her. He looked at the table behind her where the mail had been stacked yesterday, and was not stacked any longer, because she had moved it during the night, sorted into the 4 piles she had made, set neat along the sideboard. He took in the change without saying he had taken it in. Then he said, "No, ma'am, I would not mind." "All right," she said. "I'll need to ride into the stockyard with you next sale day. I want to see the scale." He drank his coffee. He was quiet a long time. Then he said, "Cal said you knew figures. My father was an accountant. He kept the books for 3 banks before they sold him out. He taught me at the kitchen table from the time I was 7 years old. He's still living? No. I'm sorry. So am I. He nodded. He drank the rest of the cup. He stood. He said, "Sale day's Tuesday next. We'll go in together. I'll have Cal saddle the buckboard." He took his hat off the peg by the door. He stopped on the way out and looked back at her once. "Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Whitmore, the coffee's good, thank you, Mr. Calder." He went out. The screen door slapped softly behind him. The week ran out, and she did not take the Thursday eastbound. She had not in her own mind ever intended to. She had said she would stay the week and see, and she stayed the week and she saw. And what she saw was a ranch that had been a good ranch and was still a good ranch, under the surface, and was being slowly bled by something she had not yet put her hand on but could feel the shape of through the paper. She had grown up in a house where her father said often that a ledger was a body, and a sick ledger felt like a sick body if you ran your hand across it. And you did not need to know yet what the sickness was. You only needed to know it was there, and to be patient enough to find it. The Calder ledger was sick. She knew already where 2 of its wounds were. She rode out with Holt on Tuesday next to find the 3rd. The Bitter Creek stockyard sat at the south end of the town, on a flat of trampled earth between the rail spur and the freight road. There were 3 sets of pole pens, a chute, a loading dock, built up to the height of the cattle cars, and at the head of the chute, the scale. A long iron platform built into the ground, with a beam balance overhead and a small wooden booth at the side where Marsh's man sat with the weighbook. Holt had brought in 6 head, 4 steers, and 2 cows, lean from summer pasture but sound. Cal Burnside, the foreman, came with them, a wide, gray-mustached man in his 50s, whose eyes went to Augusta with open curiosity and open approval both, and who tipped his hat to her, and said it was a pleasure he had been waiting on, ma'am, and she said the pleasure was mutual. Burnside, and that she had read his letter with great care. He laughed once and said he had written it with great care, and she said she could tell, and they understood each other from that moment forward. 4. Marsh's man at the booth was a thin, red-haired clerk named Pettit, who chewed the end of his pencil and called out the weight as each animal was driven onto the platform. The gate at the back of the platform clanged shut with a sharp metallic sound each time an animal stepped on, and the gate at the front clanged open each time it stepped off. Pettit shouted the figure to the boy with the chalk. The boy wrote it on the slate, and Pettit transcribed it into his bound book. The 4 steers and 2 cows came across at weights between 800 and 1,020 pounds. Augusta stood at the rail with her little book open in her gloved hand and a pencil between her fingers, and she watched the needle of the beam balance every time. She watched the needle as the animal stepped off the scale, and the gate clanged, and the platform rang, and the needle settled back to where it would settle. The needle did not settle on 0. It settled, every time, a hair past 0. Perhaps 2 pounds, perhaps 3. Hard to read at the distance she stood. Pettit, before the next animal was driven on, leaned forward and tapped the side of the booth with his knuckles, and the needle bumped over to 0. He did not adjust the balance with the screw. He tapped the booth. He tapped it as a man taps a barometer. She wrote in her book. She did not write the words crooked scale, she wrote the numbers. And. She wrote each weight, as Pettit called it, and then in the next column, she wrote the weight she would have estimated by eye. She had learned cattle weights at her father's knee, too, because her father had kept the books of a Missouri stockman before the bank years, and the difference between her column and Pettit's column was, every time, between 30 and 40 pounds. On a 1,000-pound steer at 4.5 cents, the pound that was $1.25 a head, lost. On 6 head, $7.50. On a full ranch's annual sale of 400 head, $3,000. Year after year after year. She wrote. She did not look up. She did not speak. When Pettit happened to glance her way, she was a heavy, quiet woman, writing in a book, and her face gave him nothing, and he went back to his chewing of the pencil and his calling of the numbers. Aldous Marsh came out of the office at the back of the lot, just before the last steer crossed the scale. He was a tall, soft-bellied man in a fawn-colored suit with a black string tie and a silver watch chain looped twice across his vest, and his face was pink and shaved and pleasant, and he wore the kind of small spectacles that sat on the end of his nose and obliged him to tilt his head back to look at a person. He saw Holt and lifted his hat and called out, "Calder! Good to see you, my friend. Good to see you." And he came down the boardwalk with his hand out, and Holt shook it without enthusiasm, and Marsh turned to Augusta, with his hat still in his other hand. "And this," he said, "must be the lady I've heard so much about, Mrs. Calder. Miss Whitmore. Miss Whitmore. Forgive me. Welcome to Bitter Creek, Miss Whitmore. I trust you find our country agreeable. I find it interesting." His eyes went very briefly to the little book in her hand, then back to her face. He smiled a banker's smile. "An accountant's word that? Interesting? My father was an accountant." "Was he? Indeed. Holt, my boy, will I see you?" "Thursday for our chat. We have a few small matters." "I'll come in," Holt said. "Good man." Marsh tipped his hat to Augusta. "Miss Whitmore, a pleasure. Don't let our rough country send you home too quick. We grow on people here. Like sage." "Like sage," she said. "Yes." He went back up the boardwalk. He did not look at the scale once. He did not need to. In the wagon riding home, Cal Burnside looked at her sidelong and said, "You saw something?" "I saw a needle that resets a hair past zero every time the gate clangs." Cal whistled. Quietly, one low note. "Don't say anything yet," she said. "I haven't proved anything yet. I've only seen something." "Yes, ma'am, Mr. Calder. How many head do you sell off this place in a year?" Holt, without looking at her. 400. 450 on a good year. 380 on this last one." "Thank you." She wrote it down. She underlined it. They rode the rest of the way home in silence. Cal Burnside had hired 3 hands for the summer and fall work. The eldest was a Mexican vaquero named Tomas, who spoke very little English and saluted Augusta gravely the first morning she set a plate in front of him, and never spoke of her size to anyone, ever. The middle was a Norwegian boy named Helmar, who was 19 and shy and went red to the ears every time she addressed him directly. The youngest was a boy of 17 named Denny Rourke, who had a fox-colored cowlick that would not lie flat, and a mouth he had not learned to govern. He called her the heifer. On the second day she was there. He said it at the bunkhouse door to Hjalmar, in a voice meant to carry and not to carry the way boys that age judge their volume, and Hjalmar went red and looked at his boots, and Denny laughed. Holt was in the barn. Holt did not hear it. Augusta was on the back porch, hanging out a tea towel on the line, and Augusta heard it perfectly well. She did not turn. She did not put down the tea towel. La. She finished pinning it and went back inside and went on with what she had been doing, which was rendering down a quart of bacon drippings in a tin for the next batch of biscuits. At supper that night, she set Denny's plate down in front of him with 1 extra spoon of stew on it, and 1 extra biscuit, and a piece of yellow butter the size of a walnut on top of the biscuit. She set it down without looking at him, and she said, "Eat, Mr. Rourke, you're growing." Denny stared at the plate. He looked up at her. He looked at Hjalmar across the table. Hjalmar did not look at him. While Denny looked down at the plate again. He ate, slowly. He cleaned the plate, and did not speak. When she came around with the coffee pot, he held his cup up to her, with both hands the way a child holds a cup up to its mother, and she poured, and she went on around the table without acknowledging it. Cal watched her do all this from the head of the table, without any expression at all on his wide gray face. After supper, on the porch, he said quietly, "He won't do it again." "He will," she said, "but he'll think about it first." "Why'd you feed him extra?" "Because he expected me to do less." Cal made the low whistle again. He took a pull off his pipe. He said, "Miss Whitmore, may I say something?" "You may. I have been a foreman for 31 years. I have written one letter in all that time, on the personal account of the man I work for. I want you to know that I knew what I was doing when I wrote it. I want you to know I would write it again. Mr. Burnside." "Thank you, Cal." He went down off the porch and into the dusk, toward the bunkhouse, and Augusta stood at the railing and looked out at the cottonwoods along the creek, and the first stars coming up over the broken hills behind them, and she thought, All right then. In the saloon in town that evening the men at the long bar adjusted their wagers. Sunday had come and gone, with the heavy mail-order woman still on the Calder place. The men who had bet 3 days had paid out to the men who had bet 7, and the men who had bet 7 were watching the calendar carefully, and the men who had bet 2 weeks were ordering whiskey on credit against their winnings. The longest bet on the board, written in chalk on the slate, behind the bar where the bartender kept the standing pool, was 30 days. Nobody had taken 60. Port. Marsh, sitting at his usual corner table with a small glass of brandy untouched in front of him, looked at the board once when he came in, and once when he left, and he did not speak of the pool to anyone, and he did not write his own name down. Eleanor Hollis came on a Tuesday afternoon, 2.5 weeks after Augusta had stepped off the stage. She came in a small black phaeton drawn by a black mare, and she drove herself, and she was perhaps 68 years old, with a long, fine, bony face and white hair piled high and pinned with tortoiseshell, and she wore a black traveling dress and a gray cape. And she carried, in both gloved hands, a quart jar of dark amber honey with a brown wax seal across the lid. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Hollis, I have brought you honey. It is from my own bees. They are bad-tempered bees, and they make exceptional honey, which is, I have found, the way of most things. Will you come in?" "I will come in." She stayed 4 hours. She drank 3 cups of black tea. She ate 2 slices of the lemon cake Augusta had baked that morning, out of a tin of preserved lemons she had found at the back of Mary Calder's pantry shelf, lemons 3 years old and still sound. She sat at the long pine table with her hands folded around her cup, and she looked around the kitchen, the swept floor, the polished stove, the apron taken down off the peg, and washed and rehung. The towers of mail gone, and she said, "Well, my dear." "Well." "Mrs. Hollis." "Eleanor. Eleanor, I have to ask you something. Ask. Did Mary Calder ever say anything to you about Mr. Marsh before she died?" Eleanor Hollis set the cup down. She looked for a long moment at the apron, with the small blue flowers on the peg. Her old hands tightened a little on the table edge. "She did," she said. "Yes. She came to me at the church social, the Sunday before the fever took her. She took me by the elbow and walked me out into the side yard. And she said, 'Eleanor, I think Aldous Marsh is counting wrong on purpose. I have been over the figures 4 times, and they do not come out.' But," I said, "Are you sure, Mary?" And she said, "Eleanor, when have I ever not been sure? Did she write any of it down? She kept every receipt of every transaction of every kind on this ranch, in a tin she kept in the spring house, because she did not trust the dryness of the kitchen for paper. She told me so herself once. She said, 'Eleanor, if anything ever happens to me, You tell Holt to look in the spring house, in the tin behind the second crock from the door. Did you tell him? I told him 3 weeks after she was buried. He looked at me as though I were speaking a language he did not understand, and he walked out of the room, and we have not, in 3 years, spoken of Mary again, and I have not, in 3 years, asked him whether he ever opened the tin. Augusta let out a breath she had not known she was holding. He didn't, she said. No, said Eleanor. I did not think he had. I'll go tonight. You do that, my dear. Eleanor reached across the table and put one bony hand over Augusta's. The hand was cool and dry and very strong, and Miss Whitmore. Augusta, I have lived in this country 41 years. I have buried a husband and a son. I have watched the families that built Bitter Creek either hold their ground or sell out cheap to Aldous Marsh and disappear east, and there have been more of the second than the first. And every one of the sales has had the smell about it of something Mary Calder might have called. I am an old woman, and I have not had the figures to prove anything. If you have the figures, my dear, you will not stand alone. I am beginning to have the figures. Good, Eleanor, yes. Why didn't you come sooner? The old woman looked at her for a long moment. There was something in her face that was very tired and very honest. Because Holt Calder closed his door 3 years ago, she said. And I did not know how to make a man open a door he had closed. And then I heard that Cal Burnside had written a letter, and I thought, well, we shall see what comes in on the stage. She rose. She set the empty cup on the table. She kissed Augusta on the cheek, dry and quick and firm. I will come back next week, she said. I will bring more honey. And I will bring the names of 4 ranching families that sold cheap to Mr. Marsh in the last 10 years. In case you find you should like to write to them. She drove away in the black phaeton in the long slant of late afternoon light, and Augusta stood on the porch and watched her go. And Tully the dog leaned against her skirt, and she put her hand absently on his head. She waited until after supper. She waited until Holt had gone out to the barn for his evening walk through, which she had learned he took every night about 9, and which took him about 3/4 of an hour. She took the kitchen lamp, and she walked out across the yard to the spring house, a small low stone structure built down into the bank above the creek, where the cold water seeped through, and she opened the heavy plank door and went in. The cold hit her face like a hand. The smell of damp stone and milk, and a faint sweet rot of last summer's butter. She lifted the lamp. There were 2 crocks on the stone shelf along the back wall. The first crock was a butter crock with its lid cracked across. The second crock was a larger thing, vinegar by the smell, with a tight wooden lid still sealed. Behind the second crock, pushed back against the wall, was a tin. It was an oblong biscuit tin, English by the design on the lid, faded red and green with a picture of 2 children on a swing. She lifted it. It was heavier than she had expected. She set the lamp down on the shelf, and she pried the lid up with her thumbnail, and she looked inside. Receipts. Hundreds of them. Folded once. Stacked, careful. Tied in bundles of about 30, with brown string. Each bundle had a slip of paper on top in a small, careful schoolmistress hand. Bank, 1879. Bank, 1880. Stockyard, 1879. Stockyard, 1880. Feed, 1880. Saddlery, 1880. Bank, 1881. Stockyard, 1881. And so on, year by year, neat as a church record, until the last bundle, the bundle for 1882, which ended in the spring of that year and went no further, because that was the spring Mary Calder had died. Augusta closed the tin. She held it against her chest for a moment with both hands. She thought, Mary Calder. Then she took the tin and the lamp, and walked back across the yard to the kitchen. And she set the tin on the long pine table. And she sat down at the table with it in front of her, and she did not open it again that night. She put her hands flat on the lid, and she said quietly, "All right, we'll begin tomorrow, thank you." She put the tin on the high shelf above the sideboard, where she kept her flour. She put a folded tea towel over it. She damped the lamp. She went to bed. The next morning early she set Holt's coffee down in front of him, and she said, "Mr. Calder, I went to the spring house last night. Mary's tin is here. It's on the shelf in the kitchen." Holt's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He set the cup back down. He did not look at her. He looked at the grain of the table. He looked at it for a long time. Then he looked up, finally, and he met her eyes for the first time since she had come. His eyes were gray and tired and very, very far back in his face, like a man at the bottom of a well looking up. "You found it," he said. "I found it." Mary kept it. She kept everything. Every receipt of every transaction since 1878. It's bundled by year and labeled in her hand. It is the most careful set of household records I have ever seen, and I have seen a great many. He breathed in once. He breathed out. He picked the cup up again, and his hand was steady. "All right," he said. "I am going to use them," she said. "Against the note." "All right. It may take me a little time." "Take what time you need." "Mr. Calder." Holt. Eleanor Hollis came yesterday." "I know. I saw the phaeton. She told me Mary said something to her at the church social. The Sunday before she died. She said Mary thought Mr. Marsh was counting wrong on purpose." There was a long silence. Holt looked down at the cup. He turned it once in his hands. "Mary said that to me too," he said. "A week before. She said, 'Holt, I'm going to take the books down to Cheyenne after Roundup and have a man look at them.' I told her she was tired, and to leave it till spring. She got the fever the next Wednesday." He paused. "I didn't take the books down to Cheyenne. You couldn't have known. I could have listened." Holt. He shook his head once, slowly. He drank the rest of the coffee. "Use them," he said. "Use whatever you need to use the tin, the kitchen. Anything in this house." He stopped. He looked at her. "I am not most men. Most men, I think, would have told you to leave on the first stage and not come back. I did not. There was a reason I did not. I do not know yet what the reason was. But I am going to find out, and so are you." It was the most words she had heard him put together at one time. She nodded. She did not, anywhere on her face, let him see what those words did to her. She turned to the stove and lifted the kettle and refilled his cup. And she said, "All right then, we will find out together. All right." She worked through the receipts for the next 10 days. She worked at night, by lamplight. After the supper dishes had been washed, and the men had gone to the bunkhouse, and Holt had gone out for his walk through and come back in and gone to his room at the end of the hall, she worked at the long pine table with the receipts spread in front of her, and the original note at her elbow, and a tall stack of fresh butcher paper. She had Cal bring her from the mercantile in town. She filled 23 pages with figures. She reconstructed every payment Holt had made to the bank from August of 1881 to the spring of 1882, when Mary had died and the careful records had stopped, and she found in Mary's records the exact figures Marsh had charged on each payment. Were short by between $2 and $7 every time. Not large amounts taken one at a time, but every time. In Marsh's favor. Every time. She moved next to the stockyard statements. She matched Mary's way tickets, kept from the years before the death, against Marsh's printed stockyard summaries, and she found the same pattern. On every consignment, the weights as recorded by Marsh's clerk, Pettit, were between 3 and 4% below the weights Mary had estimated and noted on her own ticket at the time of the drive. 3%. Year after year. On 400 head a year. At 4.5 cents the pound. For 7 years. She did not need to do the math to know what it amounted to. She did the math anyway. She wrote the figure at the bottom of the page in a neat hand, and she underlined it twice. The figure was a little over $21,000. $21,000 Holt Calder had earned with his cattle and his land and his back, and which had gone into the pocket of Aldous Marsh in increments small enough that no one looking once at any single transaction would have called it theft. It was theft. It was theft on a careful and patient and very long-running scale. And it was. She understood now with a clarity she had not yet allowed herself. Not theft for its own sake. It was theft with a purpose. Marsh did not want $21,000. Marsh wanted the creek, the only year-round water for 20 miles. The note would come due. The note would come due in a foreclosure, eventually, because no operation could survive being bled at that rate forever. And when the foreclosure came, Marsh, through some shell or other she did not yet know what, would buy the land at auction for pennies on what it was worth, and he would own the only water for 20 miles. And he would own, by extension, every ranch around it, because every ranch around it would have to come to him on his terms for water rights forever. She sat back in the chair. She set the pencil down. She put her hands flat on the table. She thought in the steady, quiet voice. She always thought when she had understood a thing fully. All right. So that is what this is. She thought about the men at the saloon window placing coins on a wooden bar, betting how many days she would last. She thought about the boy on the boardwalk shouting about a barn door. She thought about Denny calling her the heifer to Hjalmar. She thought about the small smile Marsh had given her when she had said her father was an accountant. She did not feel angry. Anger, in her experience, was a thing the body made to keep the mind from doing the work. She felt instead a great calm. The calm her father had said was the only useful thing in an accountant, and which he had said could not be taught, and could only be grown like a tree, by standing in one place for a long time and not bending. She gathered the pages. She folded them into Mary's tin, on top of the receipts. She slid the tin back onto the high shelf and covered it with the tea towel. She damped the lamp. She went to bed. She did not yet have what she needed. She had the rate. She had the underweighing. She had Mary's hand to corroborate both. What she did not yet have was the link between Marsh the banker and Marsh the stockyard, the proof that the same hand that wrote the note also tapped the booth that bumped the scale. Without that link, Marsh would say in court, if it ever came to court, that he was only the bank, and the stockyard was a separate concern, run by an independent company, and any irregularity at their scale was a matter for them to answer to. She needed the incorporation papers of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company. She needed to know who owned it. She suspected she already knew. She needed to be able to prove it. She drafted over the next 2 evenings a letter to the territorial capital at Cheyenne, addressed to the Secretary of the Territory, requesting a certified copy of the incorporation papers and the current ownership register of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, under the Public Records Statute of 1880, and which she happened to know required the office to provide such records upon written request and the payment of a $1 fee. She enclosed a dollar coin in the envelope. She gave the envelope to Cal at breakfast and asked him whether anyone he trusted was riding south. Cal looked at the envelope. He looked at the address. He looked at her. "I'll ride it myself," he said. "It's 3 days." "I'll write it myself, Cal." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." "Yes, ma'am." He left that afternoon on the Bay Gelding. He told Holt he had business at the Capitol. Holt did not ask what business. Holt did not ask a great many things now. There was a quality to the way Holt moved through his own house that had begun to change. He had begun to come in through the kitchen door, the back kitchen door, the one with the peeling green paint. He had begun to take his coffee in the kitchen rather than in the front room. He had not yet, that she had seen, looked at the apron with the small blue flowers on the peg by the door, and she had not yet, that he had seen, taken it down. They moved around it together, around the small, careful shape of Mary Calder, with a kind of mutual courtesy she could not have described in words. On the evening of the fourth day after Cal had ridden out, Denny Rourke came to the kitchen door at sundown with his hat in his hands. "Miss Whitmore, Mr. Rourke, I—" He stopped. He looked at the floor. He looked at the door frame. He looked at his hat. His ears were red. His fox-colored cowlick stood straight up. "Come in," she said. "Sit down. There's coffee." He came in. He sat at the corner of the long pine table where she pointed. She set a cup down. She did not pour yet. "You came to say something." "Yes, ma'am." "All right." He turned the hat in his hands. He worked his jaw. He said finally, "You feed me a full plate." "I do." "You've been feeding me a full plate every night since I called you what I called you." "Yes." "Why, because I was raised to feed people, Mr. Rourke. And because how a man treats me does not change how I keep my kitchen." He swallowed. He nodded. "Miss Whitmore, yes. There's something I have to tell you. I have not told anybody. I have not told Mr. Burnside. I have not told Mr. Calder. He stopped again. He took one long breath. "I have been taking money from Mr. Marsh." She did not move. She did not speak. "He pays me $1 every sale day. He pays me $1 to come the night before and to—" He stopped. He looked at the table. "There's a screw on the underside of the scale, platform. He pays me to crawl under there and turn it 3/4 of a turn against the spring. It makes the needle rest a hair past zero when the gate clangs. I do it for him. I have been doing it for him for a year and a half. I started before Mr. Calder ever hired me on, when I was still in town. Mr. Marsh asked me on the boardwalk one evening if I wanted to earn $1. She still did not move. "Tomorrow, Mr. Rourke," she said. "Would you say all that again slowly while I write it down?" He swallowed. He nodded. She got up. She got a fresh sheet of butcher paper. She got the pencil. She sat down across from him. She said, "From the beginning, please. Your full name, your age. How you came to know Mr. Marsh," he told her. She wrote. He spoke for nearly an hour. When he was done, she read it back to him aloud, slowly, every line. And she asked him at the end of each paragraph whether what she had written was true. And he said, "Yes, ma'am," each time. At the bottom of the page she wrote, in a careful hand, "Sworn this 9th day of September, 1885, and she dated it. And she set the pencil down and turned the paper to face him. "Will you sign it?" "Yes, ma'am." He took the pencil. He wrote his name. His hand was shaking. He wrote Dennis Patrick Rourke. He gave the pencil back to her. "Mr. Rourke." "Yes, ma'am." "Have you eaten?" "No, ma'am." "Sit there." She got up. She put a plate in front of him, beans, a piece of ham, 2 biscuits. She poured the coffee. She set butter beside the biscuits, a yellow piece the size of a walnut. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. His eyes were full. She turned back to the stove and busied herself with a pot that did not need busying with to give him the privacy of the moment. He ate. He did not look up while he ate. When he was done, she said, "Mr. Rourke, you will not go back to that scale. Not this Tuesday. Not any Tuesday. If Mr. Marsh asks for you, you will tell him you are sick. If he comes here, you will let me speak to him. You will continue to work for Mr. Calder. You will do your work. You will say nothing of this conversation to anyone, including Mr. Burnside. Until I tell you, do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Go to bed." He stood up. He pulled his hat on. He stopped at the door. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, I'm sorry." "I know," she said. "That's why I fed you. Go to bed." He went. She sat at the table for a long time after he was gone. She folded his statement once. She put it inside Mary's tin. She put the tin back on the shelf. She put out the lamp. She sat in the dark kitchen and she listened to the cottonwoods. Cal came back from the Capitol on a Saturday afternoon. He came up the road slow on a tired horse with a leather case strapped behind his saddle. And he came into the kitchen and dropped the case onto the long pine table and said, "I have it." She opened it. Inside were 3 documents bound with red tape and bearing the embossed seal of the Territory of Wyoming. The first was the Articles of Incorporation of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, filed June 1879. The second was the current ownership register of the same. The third was a notarized statement from the secretary's clerk confirming the register was current as of the previous Monday. She read the ownership register first. Bitter Creek Stockyard Company. Common shares issued 200. Holders, Petty, Robert J., 10 shares, Greaves, Henry 10 shares, Marsh, Aldous J. 180 shares. She set the paper down on the table. She looked at Cal. Neither of them spoke. She put the documents back into the case. She closed the case. She set the case on top of Mary's tin on the high shelf. She covered both with the tea towel. "Call." "Yes, ma'am." "Thank you." "Yes, ma'am." That was a Saturday. On Sunday afternoon, the dog Tully began to bark at something on the road, and Augusta went out onto the porch and shaded her eyes, and she saw 2 riders coming up at a deliberate pace through the long slant of October light. One of them rode a fawn-colored horse and wore a fawn-colored suit and a black string tie. The other rode a gray, and the lowering sun caught and held on the small silver star pinned to the front of his vest. Holt came around the corner of the barn with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and a piece of bridle leather in his hand, and he stopped, and he looked at her on the porch, and he looked at the road, and he set the bridle leather on the rail of the corral, and he walked over and stood beside her on the porch step. He did not speak. He smelled of horse and sweat and creek water. His hand hanging at his side was very still. Marsh dismounted at the hitching post. The sheriff, a man named Kearney, whom Augusta had not yet met, dismounted with him. Marsh tied his horse, and he took a folded paper from inside his coat, and he came up the steps with the paper held out in front of him as though it were a gift. His banker's smile arranged carefully on his pink face. "Holt, Miss Whitmore. Sheriff Kearney and I have ridden out together on a matter of business, and I'm very sorry to bring it to you on a Sunday. But the law moves on its own schedule, not on mine." He held the paper out. Holt did not take it. Holt looked at it as a man might look at a snake on the doorstep. Marsh said gently, almost kindly, "It is a notice of acceleration, Holt. Your note has gone into default under the provisions of Clause 19. The default clause, you'll recall, and the bank is, regretfully, calling the entire balance due. We have set the foreclosure auction for the first Monday of fall, which gives you 6 weeks to make whatever arrangements you can. I am, as you know, very sorry." Holt's face had gone the color of paper. He opened his mouth. No sound came out his hand. The one that had been very still began to shake at his side. Augusta stepped forward. "I'll take that, Mr. Marsh. She took the paper out of his hand. She did not look at him. She unfolded it. She walked with the paper open in both hands, 3 slow steps along the porch, to the place where the late afternoon sun came in, clean across the boards, and she held the paper up to the light. The text was crisp. The seal was crisp. The signature of Aldous J. Marsh, President, was at the bottom in his sloping hand. The signature was dated yesterday. In the very lower right corner of the second page, in faint blue, typed so small a person not looking for it would never have seen it, was a printer's date stamp. A single line. The line read, BCB and T Printing, set the 28th of August, 1885. The 28th of August. 11 days before the September payment Marsh now claimed Holt had missed. The notice had been printed and the typeset 11 days before the alleged default. It described. Augusta folded the paper once, neatly. She turned. She walked back along the porch. She stopped in front of the sheriff. She did not look at Marsh. She looked at Sheriff Kearney, who was a long-jawed man of 40 with tired eyes, and she said, in a voice perfectly calm and perfectly level, and pitched just loud enough for everyone on the porch to hear, and no one beyond it. Sheriff, I'd like to keep this. Sheriff Kearney looked at her. He looked at Marsh. He looked at the folded paper in her hand. He worked his jaw once. Ma'am, he said slowly, that's the bank's served copy. You'd be entitled to it. Thank you. She slid the paper into the pocket of her apron. She put her hand flat over the pocket. She turned finally to Marsh. She looked at him for the first time. She let her eyes rest on his pink-shaved, pleasant face for as long as she needed to, and not 1 second longer. Mr. Marsh, Miss Whitmore. 6 weeks. You said. 6 weeks. All right then. We have work to do. She turned. She walked, unhurried, back along the porch, and through the kitchen door, the back door, the green door, Mary's door, and she did not close it behind her. She left it standing open to the October light. Behind her, on the porch, Holt Calder drew in a breath that sounded like a man surfacing out of cold water, and Aldous Marsh, after a long, uncertain moment, tipped his hat to no one in particular. And the sheriff followed him down off the porch to the hitching post, in the slow-weighted silence of a man who has just felt the floor of a room shift 1 quiet inch beneath his boots. Inside the kitchen, Augusta took the folded paper out of her apron pocket and laid it flat on the long pine table beside Mary's tin and the leather case from Cheyenne. She put her hands on the edge of the table. She did not sit down. And she looked at the apron with the small blue flowers on the peg by the door, and she said, quietly, to the empty room, to Mary Calder, to herself, all right, 6 weeks. We begin. The lamp burned down twice that first night, and she trimmed the wick both times, without leaving the chair. She had pulled the long pine table out from the wall, so she could walk all the way around it, and on its scrubbed surface she had laid out, in the order a person lays out tools before a long job, Mary Calder's tin of receipts, the leather case from Cheyenne with Holt's copy of the note, the folded foreclosure paper with its damning printer's date, the small bound book in which she had been keeping the stockyard weights, and 4 fresh sheets of foolscap she had taken from the drawer in the front room without asking. She set a pencil at the head of the foolscap, sharpened with the kitchen knife. She set a second pencil beside it for when the first wore down. She set the kettle on the back of the stove and let it murmur for company. She began with Mary. The receipts in the tin were small and yellow and folded into careful quarters, and Mary Calder had written on the back of each one, in a hand that sloped slightly to the right and never hurried. March, 1882, paid Bitter Creek Bank, $62 on note. April, 1882, paid Bitter Creek Bank, $62 on note. May 1882, $62. June, 62. There were 3 years of them, almost unbroken. And at the bottom of the tin, wrapped in a square of oilcloth, was the original note itself in Holt's slanted ranch hand print, where he had signed his name on a line a banker had drawn for him. Augusta read the note twice. She read it a third time. She wrote on the foolscap, in a column on the left, every payment Mary had recorded, with its date and amount, and in a column on the right, she wrote what the note stated terms. 10% interest, quarterly compounding, principal of $900 borrowed in the spring of 1881 to buy the south pasture would have required, at each date. She did the arithmetic 3 times because tired arithmetic was the kind that lied. By the time the kettle had boiled itself empty and she had refilled it from the bucket and set it to murmur again, she had 2 columns that did not match. The difference was not large at any single payment. The difference was steady. Month by month, Mary had paid a few dollars more than the note's stated terms required, and month by month, the bank's running balance, which Holt kept in a separate envelope tied with twine, came down a few dollars less than it should have. Over 4 years, the gap had opened into a canyon. She squared the figures and worked them backwards into a rate. She got 18.4%. She got it again. She got it a third time and underlined it twice and wrote, in the margin, calmly. The territorial statute number Cal had read aloud to her 2 days before from a thumbed almanac in the front room. The one that capped lawful interest in the territory at 10. She did not feel triumph. She felt a slow, careful anger that had nowhere yet to go, and she banked it the way you bank a stove for the night, low and even, to keep through to morning. She turned to the weight book. 6 head. The day she had stood by the Bitter Creek stockyard fence with a pencil and a stub of paper hidden in her glove, and a stub of paper hidden in her glove. 6 head, whose weights she had eyeballed at the gate against 3 years of her father's training on the Ohio yards, and whose weights she had then watched Marcia's man write down on a tag. Her eye had said one figure. The tag had said another. The gap on each animal ran about a third light. She had not believed her eye that first day. She had let the doubt sit in her ribs for 2 days before she wrote it down. Now she opened the book and lined her estimates against the tags and against the price Marsh had paid Holt that week, and she did the multiplication out loud to the empty kitchen because saying numbers aloud was a habit her father had taught her for catching her own mistakes. The figures held. Across 1 fall's worth of cattle sales, and Holt, in his quiet shame, had given her a season of Marsh's tags from a drawer in the bunkhouse. The underweighing had cost Holt Calder somewhere between $400 and $500 a year. She wrote it down. She wrote, beneath it, in her own square hand, the same hand is doing both. And she stared at the sentence until the kettle hissed again and she had to get up to move it. The dawn came up gray and clean over the cottonwoods along the creek, and she had not slept. She washed her face at the basin, re-tied her hair, put on the brown apron with the small blue flowers she had taken down from Mary's peg the morning after she found the tin, and she made cornbread and salt pork and coffee, and set 3 plates. Holt came in from the cold smelling of horse, and lay his hat on the sideboard, and looked at the table she had pulled out from the wall and at the papers she had not yet put away, and then he looked at her. His eyes had the look of a man who had also not slept. "How bad?" he said. 18.4, she said. He sat down slowly. He put both hands flat on the table. "The note says 10. The note says 10. What you have paid, against what you owe, says 18 4/10. Mary kept every receipt. I have run it 3 nights. The number does not change." He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "And the scale." A third light. Near enough. On every head I watched. On every tag you gave me from last fall. It's the same man, it's the same hand. He looked at the apron with the blue flowers and looked away. She set the cornbread down between them, and cut him a piece, and put it on his plate herself, and he ate it because she had put it there. I want, she said, when she had sat down across from him with her own plate, to write to the territorial capital today. The stockyard is a chartered company. Chartered companies have papers of incorporation on file in Cheyenne. I would like to see whose name is on those papers. You think it's his? I think a banker, who lends a man money at a rigged rate, and then buys that man's cattle at a rigged weight from a yard that does not officially belong to him, is a banker, whose name is on the yard's papers, and would rather it were not known. Holt was quiet. Then he said, Cal will write it. I was going to ask. You don't have to ask. He drank his coffee. He set the cup down. Anything you put on this table from now on you don't have to ask. That was, in its plain way, the first thing he had given her. That was not a room to sleep in and a fair home if she wanted it. She did not make a show of taking it. She nodded once, and she ate her cornbread, and after breakfast she walked out to the bunkhouse with the letter already written. Sealed in wax she had melted at the stove, and she put it in Cal's hand herself. Cal weighed the letter on his palm, as though it had a heft beyond paper. Cheyenne, he said. Cheyenne. Territorial Secretary. The articles of incorporation of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, and the names of every shareholder of record. I have written the request out. The fee is $2. I have put it inside. If they ask why a Calder Ranch wants it, tell them a Calder Ranch wants it, because a Calder Ranch is paying for it. Cal smiled. Slow and tight, the smile of a man who had been waiting 4 years for someone to give him a reason to ride hard. 6 days there, 6 back, if I push, she said. He pushed. He was gone by noon with a fresh horse and a second tied behind, and the dust of him hung in the lane a long while after he was out of sight. The day Cal rode out was the day Eleanor Hollis began, without ever saying she had begun, to ride a slow circle through the country. She came back to the Calder kitchen on the second evening with her hands full of news she did not call news. Tom Burdett, she said, setting down her gloves, had lost his 90 acres along the lower draw in '79 to a note he could not unwind, and had sold what was left to Aldous Marsh for 14 cents on the dollar after the bank's sale fell short. The Lindstroms, 2 ranches over, had gone east in '82 after their stockyard tickets came up. So light 4 seasons running, they could not meet the spring payment, and their place was now grazed by cattle wearing Marsh's brand, though the deed was in a Denver man's name. The widow Pace had signed her quarter section away in '84, for what she called a kindness. Marsh forgave the last 6 months of her late husband's note in exchange for the deed, and she now lived above the milliners in town and did fine handwork for 50 cents a day. Eleanor named 4 families. She did not raise her voice. She drank the coffee Augusta poured her, and she ate 2 pieces of cornbread. And she said at the end, I have known this for 10 years. I have not known it the way I know it now. She looked at Augusta across the table. What do you want me to do? I want you to keep visiting, Augusta said. I want you not to say my name when you visit. I want you to remember everything that is said to you, and I want you, when the day comes, to be in a particular room at a particular hour and to stand up. Eleanor Hollis, 68 years old, and the widow of the first cattleman in the valley, put down her cup and said, I will be there. Denny came on the 4th night. Augusta had gone to bed late and risen at the sound of boots on the back step. The careful boots of a man who did not want to be heard, and was therefore being heard particularly clearly, She came down in her wrapper, with the lamp turned low, and opened the green door, and there was Denny on the porch. Hat in his hands, his young face the color of old ash. "Ma'am," he said. She stepped back and let him in. She did not say a word about the hour. She set the kettle on and lit the second lamp, and sat down at the long pine table across from him, and she waited. He did not look at her when he spoke. He looked at his hat. "The scale," he said. "At the yard? There's a bolt under it. Marsh's man Cruz. He taps it with the toe of his boot when the gate clangs. You don't see him do it because the clang covers it. The needle resets a hair past zero. On a 1,000-pound steer, it eats 300 pounds. He swallowed. I knew the whole time. He give me $4 a month over my wages, to write the tags the way Cruz called them out instead of the way the needle read on the second pass, when the gate quit shaking. I took it for 16 months. He looked up at her at last. The look had something raw in it. She did not flinch from, "I called you a name the first week in the lane." "I heard you," she said. "You served me supper." "I did. I couldn't eat it, you ate it." "I couldn't taste it." He set his hat down on the table and put his hands flat beside it the way Holt had 4 mornings before, and she saw, suddenly and clearly, that Holt had taught this boy to sit at a table, the same way Holt himself sat at a table. "Tell me what to do, ma'am, and I'll do it." "Tell me again," she said, and she took up a pencil and a fresh sheet of foolscap. "From the bolt under the scale to the $4 a month, slowly, in your own words, while I write." He told her. She wrote it down, she read it back to him, line by line, and where he said, yes, she let it stand, and where he said no, that wasn't quite it, she crossed through, and wrote it the way he meant it. At the end she put the pencil in his hand, and she said, "Sign at the bottom, and date it. The date is the 8th of September, 1885. Print your full name beneath your signature." He printed Dennis Owen Hatcher beneath the signature he made. His hand shook on the last letter. She blotted the page with sand from the box on the sideboard, and she put the page into the tin with Mary's receipts. And she closed the lid, and she set the tin in the center of the table. "Sleep in the bunkhouse tonight," she said. "Tomorrow you ride out at dawn for the high camp with the others, and you say nothing about coming here. If Marsh sends to ask after you, you have been on the mountain 10 days. Cal will see to that." "Yes, ma'am, and Denny, ma'am. The thing you did was not a small thing. The thing you are doing tonight is not a small thing either. Hold both of them in the same hand. Don't lay either one down." He left through the green door with his hat back on his head, and his shoulders a different shape than they had been when he came in, and she sat alone at the table, with the lamp burning between her hands for a long time before she went back upstairs. The week after Cal rode out, Aldous Marsh felt the floor under his boots, the way a man feels a floor that is not quite level, not enough yet to name it, enough to walk differently. He moved the auction up. The new notice went up on the post outside the bank on Tuesday morning, and on the post outside the depot by noon, and it set the sale of the Calder Notes collateral, the 4,000-acre ranch, water rights, improvements, brand, for the 22nd of September, 10 days sooner than the first notice had said. He posted 2 men with rifles at the stockyard gate, and told the town it was on account of rustlers down from the Powder. He sent his clerk out to the Calder place on Wednesday, with a written refusal to accept partial payment on the note, in case anyone tried. And Holt, who had ridden in Tuesday afternoon, with $320 cash money in a saddlebag, every dollar the ranch had, was turned away at the teller's window by a young man who would not meet his eye. Holt brought the money home. Augusta took it from him at the door, and put it in the tin with Mary's receipts and Denny's signed statement, and she said, "Good. We will need it for the filing fee and the witness fares and Cal's room at the Capitol. Nothing of ours goes to that bank again, until a judge tells it to." By Thursday the bets at the saloon had moved. Huffordin. They were no longer about whether Augusta Whitmore would last to Sunday. They were about whether she would last to the auction. The new line chalked on the slate by the long mirror gave 3-1 she would be on the eastbound train by the 18th. A side bet in smaller letters offered 5-1 she would be on it by Tuesday. Men who had not laid a coin down on the original wager laid coins down on this one because the figures had moved into a range that felt like easy money. The saloon keeper, who had stopped finding it funny somewhere around the fourth night Augusta had ridden into town with her ledger book under her arm and not looked at the saloon windows, took the bets anyway because that was his trade. And he wiped down the bar with a rag and said nothing. Cal came back on the 11th day, 4 days faster than he had said. He came at dusk, on a horse white with lather, and he did not stop at the bunkhouse. He rode straight to the porch, and got down stiff-legged, and came up the steps with a leather wallet under his coat that was thicker than it had been when he left. Augusta was already at the door. Holt was behind her with a lamp. "Cheyenne," Cal said. "Inside," Augusta said. He sat at the long pine table and laid the wallet on it and untied the cord, and from it he took, in order, 4 documents. The Articles of Incorporation of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, dated June of 1881. The first share register, listing the original 5 subscribers and their holdings. An amended share register dated November of 1882. Recording a transfer, and a certified copy of the Territorial Secretary's index entry, showing the company's current officers and majority shareholder of record as of the most recent filing, which had been in March of 1885. Augusta read them in that order. She read them slowly. Holt held the lamp. Cal sat across the table with his hands on his knees and his hat on the floor beside his chair and watched her face. On the first share register, the 5 original subscribers were 5 men of the valley whose names she half knew. None of them was Marsh. On the amended register from November of 1882, 4 of the 5 had sold their shares to a Denver holding company called Pillar West Holdings, which had bought out the majority position for, the register noted, the sum of $1 and other valuable consideration each. On the certified index entry from the Secretary of State, Pillar West Holdings filed officers were listed. President, Aldous Marsh. Secretary-Treasurer, Aldous Marsh. Sole shareholder, Aldous Marsh. Augusta laid the 4 papers in a row on the table. She put her hand flat on the index entry. She said, "He owns it." "He owns it," Cal said, "through a Denver shell." "Through a Denver shell that he is the only officer and the only shareholder of, and the Territorial Secretary's office had it on file plain as day for $2 and the price of a polite request." Cal exhaled. "Ma'am, the clerk who pulled it for me said I was the second person to ask in 9 months. Who was the first?" "A federal man up from Denver asking about Pillar West." The clerk didn't say more. He didn't need to. Augusta sat with that for a long, quiet moment. Then she folded the papers back into the leather wallet and tied the cord, and she said to Holt, "I will ride to Sweetwater tomorrow. Judge Pryor sits there on the 3rd Friday of the month. I am going to file a petition for an emergency hearing under the usury statute, and a separate petition for an injunction against the foreclosure sale, pending a finding of fraud. I am going to put these papers under his hand. I would like you to come with me. I'll come. I would like Cal to come, to swear to where he got the papers and how. I would like Eleanor Hollis to come, because a judge listens differently when a Hollis is in his room. I would like Denny to stay on the mountain until the day of the hearing, and then I would like him in Bitter Creek, and not before." "Done," Cal said. "All right," said Holt. She looked at him. "Holt, this will be in front of the whole town." He looked back at her steadily. "I know. They will say things about me that they have been saying about me since the platform. They will say them louder, because they will be losing. I need you to sit still and let me speak." He thought about it. He did not answer quickly. Then he said, "I have sat still for 4 years, while a man took this ranch out from under me 1/4 cent at a time. And I can sit still while my wife takes it back." Cal looked very carefully down at his hat on the floor. Augusta did not let her face change. She said, "I have not married you yet, Holt Calder." "No, ma'am," he said. "I am aware of the order of things." She turned and went to put the kettle on, so neither man could see her face. They rode to Sweetwater the next morning at first light. Augusta and Holt and Cal in the wagon, the leather case under Augusta's hand on the seat between them. Eleanor Hollis came behind them on her own horse, with a carpet bag tied to the saddle, because Eleanor Hollis had ridden her own horse to every place that mattered for 40 years, and was not going to change now. The wagon road ran flat through sage, and broke into pine, where it climbed the divide, and they made Sweetwater by late afternoon. Augusta walked into the courthouse with her papers in a clean canvas envelope and asked the clerk for Judge Pryor. And the clerk, a thin man with ink on his sleeve, looked her over once in the way men had been looking her over since the platform, and then looking again at the canvas envelope and the way she held it. Stopped looking that way, and went down the hall to find the judge. Judge Hiram Pryor was a man of about 60, with gray hair brushed straight back, and a long jaw, and the eyes of someone who had been lied to by professionals and disliked it personally. He had her shown into his chambers, and he gestured to a chair across his desk, and he said, "Mrs. Whitmore." She said, "Augusta Whitmore, I am not yet a Mrs. Miss Whitmore." "What brings you across the divide?" "2 petitions, Your Honor, in the matter of a promissory note held by the Bitter Creek Bank against Mr. Holt Calder, and a foreclosure sale, set under that note for the 22nd of this month. I have set them out as plainly as I could. I would like, if you will allow it, to set the papers out in front of you, in the order I think they should be read." He looked at her. He had a way of looking that did not invite chatter. "Set them out." She set them out. She laid down, in the order she had laid them on her own kitchen table, Mary Calder's tin of receipts open to the first one she had pulled. She laid down the note, with the borrowed principal circled in pencil, and the stated rate underlined. She laid down her own 4 sheets of foolscap with the reconstructed running balance and the calculated rate at 18.4. She laid down the territorial statute, copied out in her own hand, with the 10% cap underscored. She laid down the foreclosure notice with the printer's date stamp circled, and the date of the alleged missed payment circled beside it, the printer's date 11 days earlier. She laid down Denny's signed statement. She laid down the 4 documents from Cheyenne in the order Cal had brought them. She did not speak while she laid them out. The judge did not speak either. He read the receipts. He read the note. He read her arithmetic and ran his thumb down her column of figures, and stopped twice, and tapped a number with his thumbnail, and went on. He read the statute. He read the foreclosure notice, and looked at the date stamp for a long time. He read Denny's statement. He read the Cheyenne papers, and when he came to the index entry naming Marsh as president and sole shareholder of Pillar West Holdings, he laid the page down flat on the others and put his hand on top of the stack and said, "Miss Whitmore." "Your Honor, where did you train?" "My father kept books for a steamship line on the Ohio. I sat at his desk from the age of 7. "He trained you well?" "He did." "How long do you need?" 40 minutes, Your Honor, to lay it out in a room. I would like the hearing held in Bitter Creek, not here. I would like the church hall, because the courthouse there will not hold the people who should hear it. I would like a Saturday, because the men of the valley are in town on Saturdays. I would like it before the 22nd. He looked at the calendar, nailed to his wall. Saturday, the 19th. Yes, Your Honor. I will issue the order tonight. The sheriff of Bitter Creek will serve Mr. Marsh before noon tomorrow. The foreclosure sale is stayed pending the hearing. Bring your witnesses, bring your tin. He looked at her. Miss Whitmore, do you understand that if I find what your papers say I'm going to find, Aldous Marsh will not only lose his note and his charter, he will face a federal indictment under the Usury Act, and he may face more than that. I understand, Your Honor. You will be the woman who put him on that train. I will be the woman who counted, Your Honor. The train will be his own doing. He almost smiled. He did not quite. He nodded once, and he picked up his pen. They rode back through the dark and slept 4 hours, and the news of the order reached Bitter Creek the next afternoon, when the sheriff, his face very still, walked the printed copy across the street from his office to the bank and handed it to Aldous Marsh through the teller's window. Marsh read it without changing color. He folded it once. He thanked the sheriff. He went back into his office and closed the door, and did not come out for 2 hours. And when he did come out, he sent his clerk to the Western Union office with 3 telegrams, and the clerk, who was sweet on the operator's daughter and therefore knew certain things he should not have known, told the operator's daughter what was in the telegrams that evening, and by the next morning the whole town knew that Marsh had wired Denver, Cheyenne, and a lawyer in Omaha, and that none of the 3 had wired him back by closing. The bets at the saloon went strange. The line on Augusta leaving by the 18th was scratched off the slate. Nothing new was chalked in its place. The saloon-keeper wiped the slate down and left it blank, and men came in and looked at the blank slate and ordered their whiskey, and did not say what they had been about to say. Eleanor Hollis rode the country quietly that week. She did not stop visiting. She did not raise her voice. She came to the Calder kitchen on Thursday evening and sat down at the long pine table and said, "Tom Burdett will come Saturday. The Lindstrom's nephew rode in last night from Cheyenne and will come Saturday. The widow Pace will come Saturday. I have asked them only to be in the room. I have not asked them to speak. If they speak, it will be of their own moving." "That is right," Augusta said. "And I will speak," Eleanor said. "Of what I know." "Yes. I have been waiting 30 years to speak in that room." "Child." Augusta looked at her. The word child, from Eleanor Hollis, who had sized her up on the porch with a jar of honey 2 months ago, and reserved her judgment, landed in a place Augusta had kept closed since the platform. She did not let it open. She said, "Then you should speak." Friday, she did not sleep at all. She sat at the table and ran every figure one more time, not because she did not trust the figures, but because she trusted her hands more when they had moved over the numbers in the dark. At dawn she washed her face and put on the gray wool dress with the black piping at the cuffs that she had brought from Ohio in the trunk. The dress her mother had been buried in 12 years before, and that Augusta had taken out of the trunk and made over for herself, and she put Mary's apron, with the small blue flowers on over it, because Mary was going to be in that room too. Whether Bitter Creek knew it or not, she tied her hair. She came down to the kitchen. Holt was already there, in a clean shirt and his good coat, and he had brushed his beard, and he looked at her in the doorway, and did not say anything because there was nothing to say. They drove the wagon into town at 9. Cal rode beside them. Eleanor Hollis met them at the church steps with her gloves in her hand. Denny was already inside, in the back row, his hat between his knees, his face the color of old ash again, but his back straight. The church hall was full. The men who had taken bets at the saloon were against the back wall and along the side benches and in the choir loft. The women of the town who had not been invited and had not asked to be were along the right-hand pews in their Saturday dresses with their hands folded. The sheriff stood by the door. Aldous Marsh sat in the front pew on the left with his lawyer from Omaha, who had come in on the eastbound the night before, and looked as though he had not slept well in the boarding-house. The lawyer wore a black coat and pince-nez and held a leather folio on his knee. Marsh wore his banker's gray, and his hands were perfectly still on his thighs, and his face was the same face it had been for 15 years in Bitter Creek, which was the face of a man who had been respected so long he had forgotten what it would feel like not to be. Ah! Judge Pryor came in at 10. Everyone stood. He sat down at the long table that had been set on the dais in front of the pulpit, and he laid his gavel beside his hand, and he did not bang it. He said, "This is an emergency hearing in the matter of the Bitter Creek Bank, by its principal, Mr. Aldous Marsh, against Mr. Holt Calder, and of related matters touching the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company. The petitioner is Miss Augusta Whitmore on behalf of Mr. Calder and herself as an interested party. Miss Whitmore, you may come forward." She came forward. She brought Mary's tin and the leather case and the canvas envelope and her own 4 sheets of foolscap and her bound stockyard book, and she set them on the small table that had been placed in front of the dais for the petitioner, and she turned to face the room. She did not let her eyes move across the room first. She looked at the judge. She said, "Your Honor, I will be brief and I will be plain. I am going to read you the note. I am going to read you the receipts. I am going to show you what was paid and what was owed, and what the difference between those two numbers is when you do the arithmetic. I am going to lay before you the foreclosure notice with its printer's date, and ask you to consider whether a document printed 11 days before the missed payment it cites can be said to have been printed in good faith. I am going to lay before you the Articles of Incorporation and the Share Register of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, and I am going to ask you to consider what it means that the man who holds the note also owns, in secret and through a Denver shell, the yard where Mr. Tatter Calder is required to sell his cattle. I am going to bring before you a young man named Dennis Hatcher, who will tell you what he saw and what he did, and I am going to ask Mrs. Eleanor Hollis to tell you what she has known of the Calder name in this valley for 30 years. I will not raise my voice. I will not ask anyone to take my word for anything. The papers will say what the papers say." She turned to the small table. She did not look at Marsh. She picked up the note. She read it aloud in full, in the same voice she would have used to read a recipe. She read the principal, $900. She read the stated rate, 10% per annum. She read the schedule of payments. She set the note down. She picked up Mary's tin. She lifted out the first receipt, and she read the date and the amount, and she set it down on the small table. She lifted the second, and did the same. She did this for 30 receipts before she stopped. She said, "There are 147 of these. I have laid out 29 on this table. The full tin will be entered into the record. The point I wish to make can be made with 29. May I?" The judge nodded. She set down the tin. She picked up her foolscap. She read the running balance. She read it slowly. She read the stated balance. The bank had given Holt each spring, taken from the envelope, tied with twine. She set the two balances side by side. She said, "Your Honor, the difference between what Mr. Calder was told he owed and what he would have owed, under the terms of the note he signed, grows month by month. I have calculated the implied rate from the cash flow. It is 18 4/10%. The territorial statute caps interest at 10. She held up the statute copied in her own hand. The judge nodded. She set it down. She picked up the foreclosure notice. She held it to the lamp on the small table. She said the printer's date stamp in the bottom corner of this notice reads the 18th of July, 1885. The notice declares the note in acceleration on the basis of a missed payment, dated the 29th of July, 1885. The notice was printed 11 days before the missed payment it cites. The room, which had been very quiet, became quieter. She set the notice down. She picked up the Cheyenne papers. The Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, she said, is a chartered company. Its articles of incorporation, filed in June of 1881, list 5 subscribers. In November of 1882, 4 of those subscribers transferred their shares to a Denver holding company called Pillar West Holdings for the sum of $1 each and other valuable consideration. The certified entry from the Territorial Secretary dated March of this year names the president and sole shareholder of Pillar West Holdings. She paused. She looked at the judge. He is sitting in this room, Your Honor. He is the man who holds the note against Mr. Calder. He is the man whose scale at the Bitter Creek yard has been weighing Mr. Calder's cattle a third light for 4 years. The hand that lent the money and the hand that bought the cattle are one hand. She set the papers down. She did not look at Marsh. She said, I would like to call Mr. Dennis Hatcher. Denny came up the aisle with his hat in both hands. He did not look at Marsh. He looked at the judge. The judge swore him in. Augusta said, Mr. Hatcher, tell the court what you told me at my kitchen table on the night of the 8th of September. He told it. He told it the way she had written it down in his own words, slowly, looking at the judge. He told about the bolt under the scale, and Cruz's boot, and the clang of the gate, and the $4 a month over his wages. And at the end he said, I knew the whole time. I wanted said that I knew. His voice cracked on the last word, but he held it. Marsh's lawyer rose. He said, Your Honor, sit down, Mr. Whitaker, said Judge Pryor, without looking at him. You will have your turn. Whitaker sat down. Mrs. Hollis, Augusta said. Eleanor Hollis stood up from the second pew on the right. She did not come forward to the small table. She stayed where she was, her gloves in her left hand, her right hand on the back of the pew in front of her, and she spoke from where she stood, in the voice of a woman who had not asked permission to speak in a room in 50 years, and was not about to begin. Your Honor, she said, I was the wife of Josiah Hollis, who drove the first beef out of this valley in 1858. My husband knew Holt Calder's father from boyhood, and I have known Holt Calder from the day he was born. I knew his wife Mary, who is dead these 3 winters, and who, when she was alive, paid every debt she owed in cash on the day it was due. I knew Holt's father's debts, and I knew Holt's debts. I am going to name them. She named a note to Hollis's own husband in 1869 for $200 to buy a bull, paid in full in 18 months. She named a debt to the feed store in 1872, settled in beef. She named the original note to the Bitter Creek Bank that Holt had signed in 1881, and she said she had been in the bank that day and had seen him sign it, and she said the rate read aloud at the signing had been 10. She named a small debt to herself, personally, of $40 borrowed from Mary in 1882 to bury a hand who had no people, repaid by Holt in cash the spring after Mary died, with an apology for being slow. She said, I have known this man and this family for 30 years. There is not a dishonest debt among them. There has been in this valley for the last 10 years. A quiet bleeding of every small ranch by one man, and I am old enough that I should have stood up sooner, and I am standing up now. The young woman at that table is telling you the truth. Every figure she has read is a figure I would stake my own land on. And my land is not small. She sat down. The room did not move. Whitaker stood again. He said, Your Honor, with respect, my client has not had the opportunity to, Mr. Whitaker, said Judge Pryor, your client is welcome to address the figures Miss Whitmore has laid before this court. He is welcome to dispute her arithmetic. He is welcome to dispute the date stamp on the notice his bank caused to be printed. He is welcome to dispute the share register of the company, he is the sole shareholder of. He is welcome to call Mr. Hatcher a liar from where he sits. Anything else he says I do not need to hear." Marsh did not move. Whitaker leaned over and spoke very quietly into Marsh's ear for perhaps half a minute. Marsh did not look at him. Marsh looked at Augusta. He looked at her the way a man looks at a fact he has been refusing to look at directly. He did not say anything. Whitaker straightened. He said, "Your Honor, my client declines to address the petition at this time." "Noted," said Judge Pryor. He picked up his pen. He wrote for perhaps 2 minutes in silence in the open book in front of him. The room did not move. He set the pen down. He said, "On the petition of Miss Augusta Whitmore, I find that the promissory note dated the 4th of April, 1881, between Mr. Gommendade, Holt Calder and the Bitter Creek Bank carries an effective interest rate in excess of the territorial statutory cap and is therefore void as to interest. I find that the foreclosure notice issued under that note was printed prior to the alleged default it cites and is therefore void on its face. The foreclosure sale set for the 22nd of September is permanently enjoined. I find further that the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company, through its president and sole majority shareholder, Mr. Preston Aldous Marsh, has operated a fraudulent weighing apparatus to the detriment of every consignor of livestock at its yard for not less than 4 years. And I order the scales at the Bitter Creek Stockyard seized today by the sheriff of this county, pending federal examination. I refer Mr. Marsh and Pillar West Holdings to the United States Attorney for the District of Wyoming for prosecution under the Federal Usury Act and such other statutes as may apply. I revoke the territorial charter of the Bitter Creek Stockyard Company effective immediately. The petitioner will submit a proposed final order by Monday noon. This court is adjourned." He did not bang the gavel. He set it down beside his hand and stood up. The room did not move for a count of perhaps 3. Then Eleanor Hollis, in the second pew on the right, brought her gloved hands together once. Then again. Then a third time. Steady, unhurried, the way a person claps at the end of a hymn. Tom Burdett in the back. Picked it up. The Lindstrom's nephew. Picked it up. The widow Pace, who had not raised her eyes from her lap through the whole hearing, raised them now and put her thin hands together. The women along the right-hand pews followed. The men along the back wall, the men who had chalked the line on the slate, and laid their coins down on the bar and shouted from the boardwalk, and made the stage driver laugh. The men who 2 months before had bet how many days the fat mail-order woman would last in Bitter Creek, those men did not clap at first. Then one of them did, near the door. Then 2 more. Then it was the whole room, not loud, not a roar. The dry, clean sound of dry hands meeting in a wooden hall, and it went on for a long, quiet stretch before it died down by itself. Augusta did not turn around. She did not look at the room. She picked up Mary's tin and folded the lid down and put her hand flat on top of it for a moment, the way she had put her hand flat on the Cheyenne Index entry at Judge Pryor's desk in Sweetwater 4 days before. Then she gathered her papers into the canvas envelope and tied the cord, and turned to Holt, who had risen from the front pew on the right and was standing with his hat in his hand, and she said, in a voice meant only for him, "We can go home." They went home. The sheriff walked across the street to the stockyard with 2 deputies before sundown, and seized the scale. He found the bolt under it. He found the toe marks on the bolt. Cruz was not at the yard. He had ridden out at noon, headed south, and was not seen in Bitter Creek again. Marsh went back to the bank with Whitaker and shut the door. And at 5 o'clock the bank closed for the day. And at 6 the federal man up from Denver, who had been sitting quietly at the back of the church hall in a brown coat no one had marked, walked into the bank's outer office and put a folded paper on the teller's counter and asked the clerk to give it to Mr. Catta. Marsh personally, and that was the beginning of the second thing that happened to Aldous Marsh that day, which did not concern Bitter Creek, and which Bitter Creek would read about in the territorial paper. That night the porch was cool, and the stars were out hard and bright, above the cottonwoods along the creek. Holt had built a small fire in the yard, because there was nowhere quite right to sit inside yet. The kitchen still full of papers, the front room still full of the silence of the week. Augusta came out with 2 cups of coffee, gave him one, and sat down on the porch step with the other in both hands. He sat down beside her. He did not sit close. He sat the way a man sits who has been alone 4 years and is learning by inches how to sit beside someone again. He said after a while, "I don't know how to do this." She did not answer right away. She drank her coffee. He said, "I would like to learn with you, if you would have it. I am not a man who speaks well. I have not been a man who spoke at all for a while. What you did in that room today, what you did in this kitchen for 2 months, I want to say it plain. I would like to marry you. Augusta Whitmore, I would like you to stay. I am asking." She looked at the fire. "I have conditions," she said. "Name them. My name on the deed. Beside yours equal. Recorded with the county clerk this fall. Yes. My ledger book is the ledger book this ranch runs by. Every figure, every payment, every sale. You and Cal both read what I write, and you ask me when you don't understand it, and you sign nothing, without my hand on it, first. Yes. The creek bottom quarter section, the 160 acres along the lower water, in my name alone, not ours. Mine. As a guarantee, Holt Calder, that no man, not you, not a banker, not a court, will ever take from me by signature what I have earned by my own hand. I will not be a woman who can be undone by a paper she did not write." She had been ready for him to think about the third one. She had been ready to wait while he thought. He said, "Yes." She turned her head and looked at him. "You said yes before I finished." "I said yes before you finished the second one." He looked at the fire. "I am saying yes again now." She did not let her face change. She drank her coffee. She let the silence be what it was for a while. Then she put the cup down on the step beside her, and she put her hand palm up on the boards between them. And after a moment, he put his hand into hers. And they sat that way for a long quiet time, with the fire crackling in the yard and the stars hard above the cottonwoods. After a while he stood up. He drew her up by the hand he still held. He walked her, without speaking, the length of the porch to the back of the house, to the green door, Mary's door, which had stood open to the October light since the morning of the foreclosure notice, and which had been the door Augusta had come and gone by for 2 months now, without remark. He stopped in front of it. He let go of her hand. He put his own hand on the latch. He had not touched this latch in 3 winters. He stood there a moment with his hand on it and his head bent, and she did not speak, did not move, did not give him anything but the small thing of being beside him. While he did it, he opened the door himself. He held it for her. She went in past him, and he came in behind her, and he closed it gently, and the kitchen was warm, and the long pine table was scrubbed clean, and Mary's apron, with the small blue flowers, hung on its peg by the door where it had hung for 4 years, untouched, and where it would hang now, Augusta understood, alongside her own. The 2 of them on the same peg in the morning. By the first week of October, the deed was drawn. The county clerk in Sweetwater, who had heard about the hearing. The way the country hears about a hearing, did the paperwork himself, and did not make Augusta wait. Half of the 4,000 acres was recorded in her name, beside Holt's joint, with right of survivorship. The creek bottom quarter section, 160 acres, along the lower water where the cottonwoods grew thickest, and the cattle drank in summer. was recorded in her name alone. The clerk stamped the deeds, and handed them across the counter and said, Mrs. Quother, because the marriage had been done quietly the Tuesday before, by Judge Pryor himself in his chambers in Sweetwater, with Eleanor Hollis and Call as witnesses, and Augusta took the papers and said, Thank you, and walked out into the October light with them under her arm. The men at the saloon paid their bets that week. The slate was clean and stayed clean. They paid in coin across the bar and did not speak the figures aloud. And when Augusta came into town on Saturdays with her ledger book under her arm and Hope beside her, they tipped their hats from the boardwalk, and they did not meet her eye, and that was a kind of seeing she would take. The stage driver, who had charged her extra for weight, came up to her outside the Mercantile one afternoon with his hat off and said, Ma'am, I was wrong that day on the platform, and I would like to say so. And she looked at him steadily and said, You were. And he nodded and put his hat back on and walked away, and that too was a kind of seeing. Eleanor Hollis came to supper every Thursday. Denny rode for the Calder brand and did not take $1 more than his wages, and went to bed early and rose early, and was by the spring the foreman Holt had needed for 10 years. Cale married the schoolmaster's sister in November, and stood best man at his own wedding because there was no one else qualified. And Augusta gave the bride a tin of receipts she had made into a kitchen box with hinges Cal had forged himself. Who had heard the whole story from the schoolmaster, who had heard it from the saloon-keeper, took the tin in her 2 hands and looked at Augusta, and did not say a word, which was the right thing to say. Aldous Marsh sat the eastbound train on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of October. His charter was stripped, his bank was in receivership. The federal indictment had come down out of Denver on the Friday before, and his bond had been set by Judge Pryor himself, and his lawyer Whitaker had not come back from Omaha. He sat on the depot bench in his banker's gray, with a single carpetbag at his feet, and his hands folded on his knees, and his face the face of a man who had been respected so long that he had forgotten, until quite recently, what it would feel like not to be, and was now beginning to remember. Augusta walked down to the depot at 11, with a sack lunch in her hand. She had made it that morning at the long pine table: cornbread and salt pork wrapped in clean paper, an apple, a small twist of salt, and she had wrapped the sack in twine and tied it with a single bow. She walked down the boardwalk in her gray wool dress, with Mary's apron under her coat. She did not hurry. She did not speak to anyone on the way. She came up to the depot bench and she did not sit. She set the sack on the bench beside Aldous Marsh, an arm's length from his hand. He looked at it. He looked at her. He did not speak. She did not speak either. She turned and she walked home. Behind her the train came in at 12 with its long whistle out over the sage, and Aldous Marsh stood up from the bench with the sack, lunch in his left hand, and his carpet-bag in his right, and he got on the train, and the train pulled out, and Bitter Creek did not see him again. Augusta walked the long way home along the creek road, because the October light on the cottonwoods was the kind of light she had not let herself stop and see, even once in 2 months of working through nights at the long pine table. The leaves had turned and were turning. The water ran low and clear over the pale stone. The cottonwoods stood in a yellow line along the bank, for as far as she could see, and somewhere among them she knew, without having to look, ran the boundary of 160 acres, recorded that week in her name alone, hers to keep and hers to leave to whomever she chose, hers as no acre of land had ever been her mother's or her grandmother's. Hers, because she had counted, and because she had not flinched, and because Holt Calder had said yes before she finished the second one. She came up the lane to the ranch house. At 1 in the afternoon, Holt was on the porch, mending a halter. He looked up when he heard her step. He did not ask where she had been. He did not need to. She came up the steps and stopped in front of him. "It's done," she said. "All right," he said. She went past him through the green door, Mary's door, her door now too, and she set the kettle on the back of the stove. The long pine table was clean. Mary's apron, with the small blue flowers, and Augusta's brown one, hung together on the peg by the door. The afternoon sun came in through the west window and lay on the boards, in a long warm rectangle. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, with her hand on the back of a chair. She had come to Bitter Creek, on a stage in August, with men at a saloon window, taking wagers on how many days she would last. She had been a fat mail-order woman, in a gray wool dress, with a trunk too heavy for the stage driver to lift, without charging her extra. And, with her az mino, she had been, the town had decided that first afternoon on the platform invisible. A thing to be looked through, to be priced by the pound, to be wagered on the way men wager on weather and dogs. She had not been invisible. She had been counted out, and there is a difference. Bitter Creek had not been blind to her. Bitter Creek had been refusing to look. That was the truer thing, and she let it settle in her now, calmly, the way she had let every other truer thing settle in her at this same long pine table over 2 months of lamplight and arithmetic. She had never been invisible. Bitter Creek had only at last learned how to look. And her worth, when at last it was named, in a room full of men who had bet against her, had not been the size of her body or the smallness of her voice or the prettiness of her face. Her worth had been a column of figures honestly kept, and a tin of receipts a dead woman had saved, and a young man's signature at the bottom of a page and an old woman's hand on the back of a pew, and her own steady refusal, from the platform to the depot bench, to be anything other than what she was. She had earned every acre of it. She poured the water into the pot, and she set out 2 cups, and she went to the green door and called Holt in for coffee.